We tell you now, plainly, so there is no mistake about what kind of woman this story concerns. She was 34 years old, and on the coldest night of Colorado December, she stood in the snow outside the only
This is
home
the
she had
only
ever
way
shared with
we
her husband,
survive the
holding
winter.
nothing but a wool blanket someone had flung
Are
after
you
her
sure
like a
you're
scrap
ready
tossed
for
to a
what
dog.
this means?
The man who cast her into that cold was her husband's own brother, Silas Holt, who had waited exactly 11 days after the funeral to declare that the homestead, the cattle, the tools, even her mother-in-law's quilts, belonged now to him by law and by blood, and that a widow with no children and no deed in her own name had no place at his table nor his hearth. She had $11 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, money she had saved a coin at a time, selling mended harness leather to men who never asked who had done the stitching, and with that $11 and that one blanket, she walked 3 days through the Elk Tooth Range to the dying mining town of Sable Hollow, where a tax notice nailed to a post office wall offered an abandoned mountain claim, cabin included, for $6 to whoever would take the debt of its unpaid land tax. Folks called it foolish, buying a dead man's shack buried under snow, so deep the roofline had vanished. But sealed inside those log walls was something that would not only change the course of her own ruined life, but would, in time, pull an entire forgotten town back from the edge of its own grave. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Maren Holt. If you're watching tonight from a place that feels forgotten, the way that cabin was forgotten, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to know. Maren had not always been a woman who counted coins by the flicker of a tallow candle. She had been raised in the town of Concordia, Kansas, in the workshop of her father, a locksmith and blacksmith named Josiah Sutter, a broad, quiet man who believed that nothing built by human hands was ever truly worthless, only waiting for someone patient enough to see what it was for. From the time she was 7 years old, she had sat on an upturned crate beside his forge, watching him coax rusted padlocks back to life, watching him run his thumb along the teeth of an old key before he ever tried it in a lock, the way another man might read a face before trusting a stranger. He taught her the discipline of listening, to the click of tumblers, to the groan of hinges, to the small sounds that told you whether a thing was broken beyond saving or only sleeping. Her mother, Eliza, taught her the other half of that same faith, how to turn a torn dress into a christening gown, how to boil bones twice before you called them empty, how dignity was not a thing that lived in what you owned, but in how carefully you tended what little you had. Maren grew up believing, the way some children grow up believing in Scripture, that value was a quiet thing, often hidden, and that the world was full of people too impatient or too proud to look for it. She married Thomas Holt at 22, a gentle, sun-brown rancher's son from the Colorado foothills who had come east to buy stock and stayed instead to court her. Charmed, he always said, by a woman who could fix a busted lock faster than she could sew a hem. They built a life together on the Holt family land outside a town called Larimer Bend, in the shadow of the Elk Tooth Range, a life neither grand nor easy but entirely their own. She kept the ledgers. She mended every strap and hinge and pane of glass on that homestead herself rather than pay a man in town to do worse work for triple the coin. And Thomas used to say, laughing, that his wife could find the good in a nail bent twice over. They had no children, though they had wanted them, and in the long winter evenings Maren often thought that the homestead itself, its fences and its well and its low stone chimney, had become the thing they were building together instead, a kind of quiet inheritance meant to outlast them both. She never once imagined that inheritance could be taken from her with a signature and a shove. The fall came the way falls often do, dressed at first as ordinary grief. Thomas took a fever in the autumn of 1888 after helping pull a neighbor's wagon from a flooded creek crossing, and within 9 days he was gone, leaving Maren a widow at 33 with a homestead deeded. She had always believed in both their names. She learned otherwise at his brother's kitchen table. Silas Holt had been the elder son, the one who had gone off to Denver years before to work in banking and land offices, the one who returned to Larimer Bend only for holidays and funerals, always a little too polished, a little too pleased with his own cleverness. He produced, 11 days after the burial, a document their late father had signed decades earlier, one Thomas himself had perhaps never fully understood, naming the land as belonging to the Holt family line and not to any wife brought into it. Silas was, by that paper, the sole surviving Holt's son, and therefore the sole legal owner. He said it kindly enough, the way a man says something cruel when he wants credit for softness he has not earned, that he was sorry, that times were hard, that a widow without children had no true claim, that he would allow her a week to gather her things. When the week came, and Maren had gathered nothing but 2 trunks of clothes and mending tools and her mother's Bible, Silas's wife decided even that was too much, and in a scene the neighbors spoke of in low voices for years afterward, Maren was put out onto the frozen dooryard with a single blanket thrown after her by a hired hand too ashamed to meet her eyes. She had $11, sewn secretly into her hem months before, a habit her mother had taught her. A woman should always keep something no one else knows about. She had her sewing kit. She had her father's small set of lock picks and tension wrenches, which she had kept all these years wrapped in oilcloth, more out of sentiment than use. And she had, most of all, a stubborn refusal to believe that a life could simply end because a man with a signature said so. She walked, because there was nothing else to do, following the wagon road south and west into the mountains rather than remain anywhere near Larimer Bend and the shame of it, until she came, on the 3rd exhausted day, into the half-abandoned settlement of Sable Hollow, a town that had boomed briefly with silver a decade before and had been quietly dying ever since the vein gave out and the Sable Hollow Mining and Trust Company had gone under in a scandal nobody in town liked to discuss above. A whisper. Perhaps 200 souls remained where 2,000 once lived, and the town wore its decline openly, in boarded windows and a church with a cracked bell and a general store that sold half of what it used to. It was outside that general store, on a notice board gone gray with weather, that Maren saw the tax auction notice. A mountain claim 2 miles up Sawtooth Creek, cabin included, structure condition unknown, abandoned since the death of its owner some years prior. Offered for the sum of its unpaid tax, $6 even. The clerk inside, a stooped man named Aldous Ferry who ran the store, and, as it happened, the town's remaining land records, told her plainly that no one wanted it. Buried in snow most of the year, 2 miles of bad trail, and besides, folks in Sable Hollow had strange feelings about that particular claim, on account of who had owned it. She asked who. He only shook his head and said the name wouldn't mean anything to a stranger, and perhaps it was better that way. Maren, who had just lost a home to men who thought they knew everything worth knowing, paid her $6 in front of witnesses, signed her name, her own name, Maren Holt, on a deed that could not be taken from her by any brother's signature, and walked 2 miles up a snow-choked trail with her blanket around her shoulders to see what she had bought. What she found, when she finally broke through drifts higher than her waist, was a small log cabin so buried it looked at first like nothing more than a snowbank with a stovepipe growing out of it. She dug for the better part of an hour, simply to find the door, and when she finally forced it open on hinges that shrieked their long neglect, she stepped into a single dim room that smelled of cold ash and dust and something like old cedar. It was humble beyond even her modest expectations. A plank floor, a stone hearth gone cold years before, a rope bed frame with no mattress, a shelf of tools rusted and nearly solid. But her father's training rose up in her the moment she crossed that threshold, the old habit of looking twice at what other people had only glanced at once. She noticed that the hearthstones did not sit quite flush, that one in particular, low and to the left of the firebox, showed the faint scrape marks of having been lifted and replaced many times over, marks no idle mason stone should carry. She knelt in that freezing room, her fingers numb, and worked that stone loose the way her father had taught her to work a stubborn lock, patiently, listening for the give rather than forcing it, until it came free in her hands and revealed beneath it a shallow cavity holding an oilskin-wrapped bundle, dry and untouched by all those years of snow and silence. Inside it she found a leather-bound ledger, a handful of letters tied with twine gone brittle, and a small brass key unlike any she had seen, its bow stamped with the initials EC. She did not yet know whose hands had hidden this, nor why, but she understood, kneeling there in the failing light with her breath fogging the air, that she had not bought an empty cabin at all. She had bought the last resting place of someone's carefully guarded truth. The days that followed, Marin spent as much time reading as she did making that cabin barely livable, stuffing its chinking with moss and rag, coaxing a fire from the old hearth, boiling snowmelt for water. But each evening, by candle stub, she returned to the ledger and the letters, and slowly a story assembled itself out of the dark. The cabin had belonged to a prospector named Elias Cade, a man Aldous Ferry had been too careful to name aloud, and the ledger was his own private accounting, not of silver claims as she first assumed, but of numbers far stranger, names of Sable Hollow families, sums of money beside each one, and dates stretching back nearly a decade. She recognized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold, that these were deposit records, the kind kept by a bank, though rougher and more personal than any bank's ledger ought to be. The letters, once she worked up the courage to untie their brittle twine, told the rest. They were written by Elias Cade to a woman named Ruth, apparently his sister, and in careful, guilt-heavy language they confessed that Cade had once served as the assistant bookkeeper for the Sable Hollow Mining and Trust Company, the very bank whose collapse had gutted this town, and that when the bank's silver played out and its manager, a smooth-tongued young man newly arrived from Denver, began quietly moving depositors' funds into his own accounts under cover of the panic, Cade had discovered it too late to stop the worst of it, but not too late to recover a portion. Rather than see that recovered silver vanish into the same corrupt hands, Cade had smuggled it out in small loads over many months, converted what he safely could into coin and dust, and hidden it here, in this cabin, meaning to return every dollar to the families who had lost it once the scandal quieted and it was safe to act without being murdered for his trouble, as he plainly feared he might be. But Elias Cade had died alone in a rockslide the winter before he meant to make things right, and his secret had frozen into the mountain along with him, and the manager he named in his letters, the young man from Denver who had orchestrated the whole ruin and let an innocent, absent Cade quietly take the town's blame in whispers ever since. Carried, Marin realized with her hand pressed flat and trembling against the page. The same family name as the brother who had thrown her into the snow. Silas Holt. It took her 3 more days of careful reading, cross-checking dates against the little she knew of her husband's family history, before she was certain rather than merely suspicious. Silas had indeed lived in Denver in those years, had indeed come to manage a mining trust before returning, conveniently wealthy, to claim the Larimer Bend homestead upon his father's and then his brother's deaths. The ledger's dates lined up with letters Thomas himself had once mentioned in passing, letters from a brother doing well for himself in banking. Marin sat with that knowledge a long while in the cold cabin, and we will tell you plainly that her first feeling was not triumph, but a kind of grief for a town of strangers who had suffered because of a man who shared her late husband's blood, grief for a dead prospector who had tried, imperfectly and too late, to do right by people who never knew his name without also cursing it. She thought of her father's old teaching, that nothing built by human hands was ever truly worthless, only waiting for someone patient enough to see what it was for, and she understood that this applied not only to broken locks and rusted keys, but to broken names and rusted reputations too. Elias Cade did not deserve to be remembered as a thief, and Sable Hollow, dying by inches around her, did not deserve to go on believing its own ruin had been an accident of luck rather than a theft it might yet, in some measure, undo. The brass key, she discovered soon after, opened not anything in the cabin itself but a strongbox, and finding that strongbox took her another full week of searching the claim's modest mine tunnel, a shallow bore some 30 feet into the mountainside that Cade had dug in his early, hopeful years before silver played out. She found the box wedged behind a fall of loose shale near the tunnel's end, heavier than she expected, and when she finally pried it open with her father's old tools by lantern light, she found not a fortune to make her rich, but something closer to what Cade himself had wanted it to be. Coin, dust, and a few bars of refined silver, a sum the ledger suggested was perhaps 2/3 of what had originally vanished, painstakingly gathered back by one guilty, frightened man over years of careful theft in reverse. It was, by any honest reckoning, not hers. It belonged to the town. Word travels fast in a place with little else to talk about, and it was not long before Aldous Ferry, calling on her out of simple neighborly concern for a widow alone on a lonely claim, noticed the ledger open on her table and went pale at the sight of Cade's handwriting. He was, Marin learned, one of the very depositors named in it, having lost nearly everything he had saved toward retiring from storekeeping. When she told him what she believed, carefully, without yet naming Silas aloud, Ferry's face did something complicated, hope and fear and old grief moving across it all at once. And he told her something that turned her blood cold. Silas Holt was no stranger to Sable Hollow even now. He had quietly bought up, over the past several years, the debt notes and back taxes on half the failing claims and buildings in town, including, Ferry now realized with dawning horror, the very claim Marin had just purchased out from under him for $6, a purchase Silas had evidently been too slow or too confident to make first. Silas Holt, it seemed, had been circling back to Sable Hollow all along, perhaps searching, in his own quiet and patient way, for the very thing Marin now held in a rusted strongbox in a mountain tunnel. Proof, or plunder, or both. Silas came himself within the fortnight, arriving in Sable Hollow with the easy, well-dressed confidence of a man who did not expect resistance, claiming he had come to inspect certain investments and had been surprised, even wounded, to learn his own sister-in-law was living in such squalor up the mountain when she might simply have written to him for help. Marin received him in the cabin doorway rather than inviting him in. The blanket that had once been thrown at her now folded neatly across her shoulders like something closer to a shawl of office than a rag of shame, and she watched his composure falter only slightly when she told him she had found what Elias Cade left behind. He tried first at charm, suggesting whatever old rumors she'd stumbled upon were exactly that. Rumors, the bitter talk of a failed town looking to blame someone for its own bad luck. When charm did not move her, he tried threat, reminding her softly that she was a woman alone with no legal standing, no family, no one in Sable Hollow who owed her loyalty over the man who held half their debts in his pocket. It was Aldous Ferry, standing quietly at her side with the ledger itself now safely copied and hidden in 3 separate places, who told Silas plainly that half the town would indeed take her word over his, because half the town remembered exactly which smooth young banker had ridden out of Sable Hollow wealthy the same season they had all gone poor. Silas left that day promising quiet ruin for her, promising he would call in every note he held on every family who dared stand with a stranger's widow against a Denver man of means. And for a few grim weeks it seemed he might make good on it, as 2 families did indeed waver, frightened for their homes, and urged Marin to simply hand back what she'd found and let old wounds stay buried with Elias Cade. But Marin had spent a lifetime learning that a thing worth saving was rarely saved by the timid, and she did not hand anything back. Instead, she did what her mother had taught her a ruined woman with nothing could still always do. She made careful, patient use of what little she had. She brought the ledger, the letters, and 2 witnesses, Ferry and an old miner named Obadiah Krantz, who had worked alongside Cade himself and recognized both the handwriting and the mine tunnel's construction, before the circuit judge who rode through the county courthouse in Placer Junction once every 2 months, and rather than accuse Silas outright of theft she'd done so many years ago that proving it fresh might prove impossible, she petitioned instead, simply and lawfully, to have the recovered funds distributed as restitution to Sable Hollow's original depositors according to Cade's own careful ledger, under her stewardship as the lawful owner of the claim on which they were found. It was a modest legal request, almost too modest to draw much notice, and that was precisely its strength. Silas, arriving too late and too loudly to contest a matter already quietly approved, found himself instead facing the very depositors he had wronged, several of whom, once they understood what stood before the judge, began asking pointed questions in open court about a Denver banking career built awfully fast on a town's collapse. He left Placer Junction that week with his reputation, if not yet his fortune, badly cracked, and word of it traveled, as such word does, back along the very banking circles in Denver he had always been so proud to belong to. The restitution itself, when it came, was not a fortune divided into equal foolish shares, but a careful, almost surgical repair, guided by the ledger's own record of who had lost what. Aldous Ferry received enough to finally retire the debt on his store and keep its shelves stocked through another hard winter. Obadiah Krantz, whose family had scattered when a mine failed, used a share to bring a married daughter and her children back to Sable Hollow rather than leave them struggling in a mining camp 2 counties over. The church with the cracked bell got a new one, cast in Denver and hauled up the mountain road by 4 teams of oxen, a gift Marin insisted on giving in Elias Cade's name rather than her own, so that the very first thing the town heard ring out over the valley each Sunday morning was a sound tied to the man they had wrongly blamed for their ruin. She kept for herself only enough to properly seal and shore up the roof of the cabin she had bought for $6, and to buy at last a proper mattress for that old rope bed frame, and a good coat, for she had discovered she did not, after all, wish to leave the mountain. Sable Hollow, broken and half-forgotten as it was, had given her something Larimer Bend never had, a place where what she brought to it mattered more than what she'd been born to or married into. And so we come back to where this story began, to a woman standing in the snow with nothing but a blanket thrown after her in scorn. We told you then that she was 34 years old and utterly cast out, and we told you she spent her last coins on an abandoned cabin buried under fresh snow, and we told you it seemed, to anyone watching, a foolish and desperate act. It was not foolish. It was the same quiet faith her father had planted in her as a girl on an upturned crate beside his forge, that nothing built by human hands, no lock, no key, no reputation, no ruined little town, is ever truly beyond saving, only waiting for someone patient enough to look twice. Marin Holt did not set out to expose a banker or a store town. She set out only to survive one more winter with dignity intact. But in choosing, again and again, to look carefully at what everyone else had written off, a dead man's cabin, a dead man's ledger, a dying man's guilty confession, she became the very thing Sable Hollow had needed without knowing it needed her. Someone willing to dig through the snow rather than simply mourn what lay buried beneath it. Elias Cade's name is spoken with respect in that town now, and so, we're glad to tell you, is hers. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Marin, and with a mountain town that very nearly disappeared. If her story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who needs reminding that value is often hidden rather than obvious, and that being cast out with nothing is never quite the same as being nothing. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real worth in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them. Until next time, stay close.